Hi, I'm Tom Koenig, and I'm joined today by the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist, Nicholas Kristof. Nicholas, thanks so much for joining me.
Delighted to be with you.
So we're here today to discuss your book, which you co-wrote with your wife, Cheryl Wudunn, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. So I want to start with a very important, straightforward question. What's your book about?
So it's about the disintegration of the working class in the United States over the last 50 years. And it's told partly through the story of the kids who were on my old school bus here in Yamhill, Oregon. I'm talking to you from Yamhill right now. It's a farm town that had done very well for about 100 years. And then jobs went away. People self-medicated with meth and alcohol. And so at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from deaths of despair, drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And so we tell that story. We show how that is reflected in communities across the country and the degree to which I think working class Americans were abandoned by both parties, and what we can do to solve these problems.
Yeah, so you're bringing a real personal perspective to this. You're embedded in that community. You're there right now. You grew up there, and I was struck throughout the book how you're kind of trying, I feel, to change the way your readers think about the issue of poverty and social deprivation, alienation, about these left behind communities that we often have been hearing about in recent years. And one of the ways you do that is through this analogy of the tightrope. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that analogy and also how it sort of strays from both liberal and conservative orthodoxies when it comes to conceptualizing and discussing poverty in America.
Yeah, no, you're right about us trying to change the narrative. I think that we have the tools to do a much better job to address poverty in America. We have the resources. What we've lacked is the political will. And I think that's partly because we have this narrative that is an obstacle. And I think that's both on the right and the left. And so, the right says, lift yourselves up by the bootstraps. And it's all about bad choices and personal irresponsibility, this kind of thing. And I'm afraid that on the left, increasingly vis-a-vis the white working class, there are an awful lot of people who say, you guys voted for Trump. I know you guys have voted for Republicans. You've done this to yourselves. You're all bigots. You're all racists. And I think it's an awful lot more complicated than that at both ends. Do people make bad choices? Absolutely. They're often on a trajectory to making those bad choices from the time they were very young. And so we cite that example that you use that metaphor of the tightrope. And, for most Americans in a good middle class context, they're not so likely to trip and stumble. And if they do, then, they fall on this, they're on this nice wide path. And if they fall, then they can, pick themselves right up. And meanwhile, there are an awful lot of Americans who are in low-income homes, in chaotic homes, in very difficult family contexts. And for them, it's not this nice, wide, green path. They're way up there in a tightrope, and they're more likely to fall. And if they do fall, it's much harder to recover.
Yeah, and just when you're talking about the analogy there, you talk about, the wide path with all these different supports. And I think one of the interesting parts of the book is that you're focused, of course, on policy. You talk about different policies. You're focused on the bread and butter issues, these aspects, like the economic aspects, but also, the social capital aspects. Like, theoretically, if, I have a real screw up, I'm blessed to have a strong family structure and supports and friends and colleagues, all these different things. And part of the story that I feel like you're telling is, yes, this economic deprivation, but also, and perhaps downstream of that, is that social alienation and the lack of these strong ties that often are what get us through our most difficult periods in life, public policy aside.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting in Yamhill, and I think in a lot of white communities around the country. Back in the 1990s or so, there was a lot of harsh rhetoric about the struggles in Black communities, and the tendency was to say it's all about deadbeat dads. It's all about bad choices. You know, if these folks will just buckle up and they don't, you know, we don't hand them welfare, then they'll be fine. And meanwhile, the great Harvard sociologist William Julius Wilson said, no, it's about lost jobs. And he was exactly right, because when those jobs left Yamhill and when they left West Virginia and when they left, you know, logging communities in Maine, the same kinds of problems unfolded. And so I do think that a lot of it was about lost jobs, but I also wondered why it is that in the Great Depression, when jobs were lost, you didn't have these same pathologies in Yamhill or in other places. And I think it was because of the point you make about social capital, that at that point people were embedded in organizations, churches, community organizations, extended families who looked out for each other and supported each other. And that created a buffer from hardship. And those community institutions disintegrated over the years. And when drugs came along, they further dissolved those kind of ties. And so the kids on my old school bus, they weren't really in part of networks that could support them. And really the exception to that, as I looked through my community, was the Mormon Church, the one institution in Yamhill, Oregon, that really was able to buffer people successfully and provide basically 100% immunity from these kinds of problems, was the Mormon Church. And that's because it still was this really, really tight network in a way that other institutions were unable to provide.
Yeah, so when we're talking about institutional decline and this withering away, I mean, it's so interesting when I hear you saying points, you know, you're towards the left side of the political spectrum, and I hear you echoing points made by people like Yuval Levin, we're on the right side. So that's when I start thinking, oh, we might really be getting on something here. We're forming some consensus. And so speaking of institutions, one of those is the family. And I want to read a quote from the book that I took down. You write, "The economist Isabel Sawhill calculates that the rise in single parenting since 1970 has increased the child poverty rate by about 25%. So that's a pretty whopping statistic. And I, you know, as we talk about this aspect of social decline, I wonder what you see the role of public policy being in this sort of space. So this, take the example of marriage. It's clearly important. The data shows us, I think a lot of common sense and life experience tells us that. Is there a role for policy to play, even if tangentially so?
Yeah, and you know, I'd say the first thing is that those of us on the progressive end need to acknowledge the role of family and marriage. And there were decades when we on the left were reluctant to, and you may remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan was savaged for emphasizing that issue, and he was seen as victim blaming. And it's not victim blaming, it's recognizing a reality. And it's, you know, look, there are plenty of kids in single family homes who do fantastically well, but on average, boys especially don't have as good outcomes. And they're also more likely to live in poverty, partly because there's only one income coming in. And so what can we do about it? You know, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, tried various marriage promotion schemes. And those, they were tested rigorously as they were introduced, and they just did not work. You know, you tell people to get married, it doesn't really work. It's often rooted in economics, and people are, if men have more income, they become more marriageable. If they don't, and if they have criminal records, they're less marriageable. So what does work to increase marriage rates? There are two things that do. So one, as I suggested, is giving young, disadvantaged men commercial skills so that they have a more stable job and income. So career academies, for example, is a program for at-risk high school students. It gives them a skill like carpentry or plumbing or to be an electrician, and that increases the likelihood that they will be in a two-parent household raising kids in that context. And the other thing that seems to work is helping girls avoid unplanned pregnancies. And if a 16-year-old girl has a baby, then she's more likely to drop out of school, to raise that child in poverty, and less likely to marry. If she can avoid that unplanned pregnancy when she's 16, then she's more likely in her 20s to get married and to raise her children in a more stable environment. So so far, the things that really seem to work are help with family planning for young people, and providing and raising incomes effectively for young men in particular.
Yes, it goes back to this theme that you talk about, especially in the conclusion. You talk about human development and the development of our human capital, how we've disinvested in ourselves or from ourselves. And just to go back to what you were just talking about with the marriageability of men via, mechanisms like having a job and stuff like that. You talk about the question of teach a man to fish versus give a man a fish. So I want to read another quote where you and your wife write, "Society needs to focus much more on jobs for two reasons. First, it is more politically sustainable for the government to provide work for the needy than to mail benefit checks. Second, working class jobs are often a source not just of income, but of self-worth and identity." So in this question of jobs versus checks, you seem to be coming down more on the jobs side of the debate. And then I just wanted to bring in some current affairs, where Senator Mitt Romney's, expanded child allowance proposal has generated a lot of debate. The New York Times editorial board more or less endorsed it. Maybe that's too strong a word, but they came out with a pretty favorable view. So what's your stance on that Romney style plan? Would you rather see more federal dollars being funneled towards job training programs like some of those that you just mentioned?
So in general, I'd say conservatives have tended to emphasize the importance of the dignity of labor, and liberals have more emphasized, redistribution and providing incomes. And at that theoretical level, I think conservatives are right. I think there's good data about this, the self-esteem and sense of self-efficacy that comes with a job. But at the policy level, I think conservatives screw up. So they tend to create, all these barriers to getting benefits by insisting that people go and look for jobs, and those don't work. What they end up doing is just cutting people off from benefits. What you need to do is provide people with skills or with incentives to get more jobs. So the earned income tax credit, for example, is a good bipartisan program that both parties that increases the rewards of a job. It's kind of an incentive to hold jobs, and that should be expanded. On the essence of the Romney plan, for example, is really kind of child allowances, and that is something that just about every advanced country does, except the U.S. And Canada used it to reduce child poverty by about 20%. It was part of the British plan that reduced child poverty by 50%. There have been various estimates that Joe Biden has a version of it that together with other things would reduce child poverty in the US by 50%. And so there are advantages to both the Romney approach to that, which goes through the Social Security Administration, versus the Biden approach, which goes through the IRS. But I just got to say, it is so thrilling that we are having a conversation about whether the Republican plan or the Democratic plan to attack child poverty is better. It is, this is, I just think this is a huge moral stain on the US. And it's not just a moral stain, it holds America back. If you try to think about, we talk about our competitive challenges from China. We're not going to address those competitive challenges with China by tightening intellectual property protections. We're going to address the competitive gaps with China by educating our kids and giving them the ability to be numerate, to be literate, to compete in the job market. And that's what we have historically failed to do. It's thrilling to see both Biden and Romney competing to address those problems.
Yeah, so to bring back Daniel Patrick Moynihan into the conversation, he wrote a book called Family and Nation back in the 80s at some point, and he said pretty much exactly what you just said, how the prevalence and pervasiveness of child poverty in the United States is a moral stain on the country. And he says, we eradicated more or less senior poverty, but that's because seniors can vote. And yeah, children can't.
Exactly. So, and I think that there's this misperception that children are resilient, and it's too bad if these kids are living in poverty, but they don't really have a standard of comparison. They may not know that they're poor, and so they'll go through some difficult years, but they're not going to starve to death, and then they'll recover. And in fact, we now know that is just not true. And it's not so much the poverty itself that is scarring; it's the trauma that is often linked to it in one way or another. It's violence in the home, it's homelessness, it's instability, it's parents splitting up, and this sense of adverse childhood experiences, of ACEs, directly corresponds to things like suicide in adulthood, and also to medical conditions in adulthood. One of the sort of fascinating things I did at one point was visit a brain scanning laboratory in Seattle that was looking at the brains of infants. And in these little kids, you could see the impact of poverty on their brain development, this crucial period, the first 1,000 days. And as I think back to the kids on my old school bus and what would have made a difference, I think it would, above all, have been outreach to help those kids early in life. One of the reasons our anti-poverty efforts in America don't do better is we start too late. We need to help kids early on.
Yeah, and you talk about early childhood education in the book, and like you were just referencing there, some of the parts of the book that really stuck with me was when you would talk about like fetal development, and you're talking about early like babies' brains development, how these conditions of poverty and where the parents are coming from educational, nutritional standpoints, all that, like it's already starting to have an effect from day one and even before. And so it just it goes back to the tightrope analogy, how we have to, yes, like acknowledge human agency and responsibility, right? But at the same time, take a step back and think about all the factors that are going into success versus not success, people falling off the tightrope.
Yeah, one of the people that we write about in Tightrope was my closest childhood neighbor, Mike Stepp, who I'd walk to the school bus with every day, and we'd walk back later. He abused drugs and alcohol. He couldn't get a good job, but used drugs and alcohol. He was homeless, and yet he remained a good guy and a good friend. And so he died recently at the age of 55. And, I was thinking about what killed him. And so the death certificate will say heart attack, but the roots of that were really laid very, very early on. His mother was an alcoholic. Nobody knows, but I suspect they may have been born with fetal alcohol spectrum effects. 2% of American kids are, and those kids are more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol as adults. He had a traumatic childhood. The father was violent in the home, would beat him, would beat the wife. And I don't think there was a book in the house. I don't remember a book in their house. So he dropped out of high school. And a kid like that, if you're a high school dropout who's been traumatized, who has a predisposition to alcohol or drugs, you're cooked. And did Mike make bad choices? Of course he did. He admitted it. But we made bad choices as a society by not providing more support, by not fighting to keep him in school. And the consequences were disastrous, not only for Mike, but also for his wife and 2 kids. He stiffed them for $68,000 in child support. He left his wife just struggling to raise these 2 kids, and she did a fantastic job. But there's just, way too much of that around the country.
Yeah, it's just so much lost potential, like what Mike could have been under different circumstances with different
Exactly.
Schools. So to close, we can talk about Mike and to talk about what would have helped. And one thing that I just wanted to touch on, you mentioned the research of Raj Chetty, I believe, in the book, and trying different economists, political scientists, sociologists have thought about, it's what a child is surrounded with has a huge impact. It's not just family, it's what sort of neighborhood they're in. So there have been some really interesting policy experiments with giving people like vouchers to move to different neighborhoods. How do you think about those policies? Because on the one hand, they seem really promising, but they also could hollow out a community like Yamhill or others that are struggling, where the social capital has been depleted, the jobs have been depleted. So maybe some of these communities might not last, so to speak, if we instituted a vouchers program, stuff like that. So what are your thoughts on those sorts of innovations?
So as somebody who deeply loves Yamhill, I very much would like to find, I'm sorry. A Yamhill neighbor calling. I deeply believe in interventions that help a specific community, geographic interventions. Frankly, they don't have a good record. It's been hard to help communities with economic development. But what has worked is things like moving to opportunity, that Raj Chetty program you mentioned. And they've been things like early childhood education, 2-generation programs. So you help an adult who's got a substance abuse problem, wean them off of that, and then that is going to help their kids too. 1 in 7 American kids has a parent who is wrestling with addiction, and that obviously that has consequences for the parent. It also has consequences for the child. And I think one of the lessons of all this is that there's no silver bullet. But there is, in a sense, silver buckshot. There are a lot of little things that make a difference, and they're hard. But vis-a-vis kids, we haven't tried hard enough. So we were embarrassed by veteran homelessness as a country. So we put a lot of effort into addressing that under President Obama, and we were able to reduce veteran homelessness by half. It's not perfect, but sure is an awful lot better than it was. If we could be similarly embarrassed by our levels of child homelessness, I think it's plausible we could reduce that by half. Now, that's not good enough. There'd still be a lot of kids that were homeless, but boy, that would be a step forward. And so I'm hoping that these days under President Biden, there really will be a serious effort to try to address this moral and practical stain on America. And I think the best leverage we have to improve America in the long run is going to be to try to empower and support America's struggling kids.
Yeah, and as we go about that, tools like Tightrope will be essential. So I hope everyone gives it a read. And Nick, thanks so much for being here and taking the time.
Oh, my pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.